The Texas justice system is messy, so let's break it down. You're listening to So You Got Arrested, the podcast that tells you what really happens after an arrest. Hosted by BRCK criminal defense attorneys, we talk to the people who've lived it, worked in it, and been shaped by it. Whether you're facing charges or just want to understand your rights, your options, and the smart moves that could change everything, we've got your back.
So, Jacob, we're very fortunate in that we have Kirsten Melton on the podcast today, and she is one of the, in my opinion, leading authorities on human trafficking here in the state of Texas. And a lot of people don't understand what that means. What is human trafficking?
So human trafficking is the exploitation of men, women, and children for forced sex or forced labor by a third party for that third party's profit or gain. So when we think about human trafficking, it's always a focus on forced labor or forced sex. If you don't hear those things, then you may have a whole lot of other crimes, but you don't have trafficking.
And just how pervasive is this problem here in the state of Texas?
So it's a fairly significant issue. The most recent Texas-specific research was handled by the University of Texas Institute for Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and that was back in 2017, so it's a little bit dated. But what they did was they took a picture of the state of Texas from up above. They created what's called a prevalence rate. And using that type of research, they indicated that we have at any given time about 313,000 victims of human trafficking in the state of Texas. Now, that includes youth and minor victims of sex trafficking and victims of labor trafficking. It did not include adult victims of sex trafficking. So that's a different population that they did not have enough research at that time.
So it's an even bigger
to be
problem.
Part of that estimate. Correct.
Wow. So it seems as if, and this just may be me, that hearing that term human trafficking is something fairly recent within the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, is this something that we're just recently in the last couple of decades paying more attention to, or?
I would say that. So the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act was enacted in 2000. Okay. And then the states began to create their own versions of trafficking laws in the years after that. So yes, in terms of that term and criminal prosecution under that term, it is a fairly recent phenomenon.
So how would you prosecute? So prior to passage of anti-trafficking laws, I mean, was the government, was the state able to prosecute the people that were carrying this type of exploitation out?
I would say they would probably prosecute pieces of what they were doing, but not necessarily identifying the whole of that crime.
So maybe as like prostitution or
perhaps, or kidnapping.
Unlawful restraint.
Correct. So there may be like pieces of that or aggravated sexual assault of a child when, in fact, there's this much broader level of commercial sexual exploitation going on.
Wow. Okay. And so these cases that we see here in Texas, I don't have a lot of experience with human trafficking. Sometimes you see this stuff in the movies, and it's these large organizations that are moving people from one place to another. How true is that? Is it normally like small little individual groups, or is it organizations? Or?
Well, let me stop you right there, right? So one of the biggest myths about trafficking is that it has something to do with travel.
Okay.
Trafficking doesn't require travel of any kind. You can be trafficked in your own home. So I'll give you an example here in San Antonio. 6-year-old girl, her mom decides she wants to start making more money, starts bringing sex buyers to the home. Oh. The buyer pays the mom a fee, takes the girl in the back room and rapes that child. Buyer leaves, girl stays, another buyer comes. Mom addicts that child to heroin at the age of 6 to make and keep her compliant.
I hope you're not telling us about a real case.
This is a real case. Sells her daughter to her first husband at the age of 12. By the time this woman is in her 30s, she has multiple teenage children from whom she is estranged. She is a lifelong heroin addict, and she ends up in our drug court here in San Antonio. And that's when she begins to process through and work through these issues surrounding her trafficking. And I was in the room when she very first spoke publicly about that trafficking. And what she said has stuck with me ever since. And she said, I used to wonder why at 8 and 9 and 10, no one was looking for me. I wasn't at school. I wasn't at the park. I wasn't at the HEB. I wasn't at the doctor's office. I was nowhere that a kid should be because I was in the back room of my house servicing sex buyers, essentially. And so that's a case that reminds us, right, that trafficking is a crime against the person, like aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, like murder, like aggravated sexual assault.
Right.
It's not a crime that requires movement. It's not a crime that requires crossing of a border. A lot of times it's confused with the crime of smuggling.
Right.
And because we're in such an elevated political kind of struggly time when it comes to immigration, that's what's on everybody's minds.
Right.
And trafficking itself doesn't require a party from outside the United States, right? You can be an American citizen trafficked on American soil by an American citizen. Yeah. We do find that people who are immigrants, and particularly those who don't have status, are at extremely high risk of trafficking.
Is that because they're more vulnerable?
Absolutely. You know, they're here in the country. They don't feel that they can access law enforcement. They don't feel that they can turn to anyone for help. And what they're learning right now, of course, is that to have that lack of status is something that's going to have you immediately removed from the country.
Right. So it's almost leverage that somebody has over them to say, hey, if you go anywhere, if you tell anyone, you're going to get reported.
You're out of here.
You're gone.
Right? You're gone. So instead, you're going to continue to work in my farm, in my dry cleaner shop, in my brothel, in whatever capacity, I'm going to continue to have you to work.
And how are these cases getting to law enforcement? Because we talked about how these victims, they don't feel safe to come out. There is no real possibility sometimes. How are they getting to law enforcement more often than not?
It's a great question. So there is a small percentage of people who actually come forward and self-identify, but that is a small percentage. A lot of times these cases come in through calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. From members of the public who see something and say something. There are also networks. For instance, if you have missing children, they're going to go through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Kids. They do a whole lot of workup, gather information. Oftentimes they find that these kids are being advertised for sale for sex on internet sex sites. And so that's going to be a trigger to send that information to law enforcement so that they can remove that child and begin an investigation into the underlying trafficking. We also will see reports from victim serving agencies. So while a victim may not be willing to come forward to law enforcement, they may take help from a victim serving agency. And then that agency may be able to help them kind of work through, hey, this is something that should be reported to law enforcement. And we have trusted law enforcement that we work with.
What's an example of a victim serving agency?
Oh, great question. So a victim serving agency could do anything from like victim advocacy or accompaniment. They may help with food or shelter, housing. Okay. They may help connect people who have immigration issues with legal services. So victim serving agencies can really cover this broad gamut of different services that they provide for victims of trafficking.
And with regard to trafficking, I mean, is there obviously, based on what you said, anybody can be a trafficker and anybody can be a victim, but is there kind of a typical profile that you might see of a victim or a typical profile of somebody who would be trafficking? So
my response to that would be that really traffickers are looking to exploit vulnerabilities. Okay. So there are certain core vulnerabilities that are easy for a trafficker to identify and then to suss out. So one of them might be lack of immigration status. One of those could easily be poverty or some sort of crisis situation that's occurred in your life where you are in need of something. It may be lack of relationship. Traffickers are quick to pick up on that and quick to establish kind of a faux family around people who need that, with the trafficker being the person who's in charge of that, right? So you've seen enough movies or things on television to know that the term daddy is sometimes associated with a pimp, right? Or a trafficker. That that framework is actually real in the sense that there's this establishment of a fake family relationship with the trafficker in the lead. You will see people who are struggling with addiction, struggling with disability. Particularly, you've got kids that are in the foster care system that lack that relationship and really kind of core base of foundation, kids that are truant and running away. So that running away piece makes children extremely vulnerable to exploitation from traffickers because they need basic needs met. And those traffickers are happy to supply that.
So is that how they get drawn in? Like basically they're living out on the streets and somebody offers them, food and a place to stay.
Shelter, somewhere to stay. And then all of a sudden you owe that person. Or that person has control, let's say, of your younger sibling. And it becomes a very quickly coercive relationship. Now, when it comes to children under the age of 18 and sex trafficking, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And we don't have to prove it when you have a disabled individual who's forced into prostitution. In all the other types of trafficking, adult labor trafficking, adult sex trafficking, child labor trafficking, and labor trafficking of a disabled adult, we do have to prove the application of force, fraud, or coercion. Because that's what changes your job, your labor, your work, and makes it forced labor, right? Is this person outside of you applying force, fraud, or coercion to make you do that work? It also doesn't matter whether your work is legal work or it's work that's illegal. So let's say you're being forced into prostitution. That's illegal here in the state of Texas. But if someone outside of you is forcing you to do that through force, fraud, or coercion, then you become a victim of sex trafficking.
And so we talked about the complexities of cases. So is that one of those elemental things as a prosecutor that becomes really difficult to prove at the trial? One of those hurdles that you really have to jump through with the jury?
Yeah, you've got to help jurors understand that it's not just physical force that puts victims in this situation. It is the exploitation of these vulnerabilities and then the application of what is coercive to that individual. So one of the cases I tried here in San Antonio when I was at the AG's office and the DA's office here had recused itself involved a guy named Steve Sumlin. And Steve Sumlin was not someone who was beating people, right? He wasn't tying them up. He wasn't threatening them with guns or knives. He ended up being convicted of trafficking for two reasons. One, he trafficked an underage child for purposes of sex. And then the second reason was he was trafficking an adult. And the coercion that he had used against her was that he knew that she had engaged in prostitution before she ended up engaged and then married and then pregnant with a baby. And so he used the threat to destroy her life, ruin her marriage, put her and her child potentially out into the world with no support as a way to continue to keep her in a position where she was forced to engage in prostitution for him. So that coercion might not be powerful to you, but to her, it was a vice, right? It was something that threatened the core of her existence. So traffickers are really excellent at reading people, figuring out that vulnerability, sometimes installing a vulnerability and then exploiting that, right? So think of your cases that involved significant domestic violence. Many of the same tactics, isolation, removing you from people that might help you in some way, information that might help you in some way, moving you from place to place, threats of force and violence, using force and violence, but then once you've used it, you don't have to necessarily use it again, right? You've already exerted your control, and so now it's simply a reminder of that control that keeps this person in line, complying and engaging in either the forced sex or the forced labor.
And so is it more prevalent to see an individual engaged in trafficking, or is it, more prevalent to see it in terms of like groups? Because I've seen cases where it's like maybe a group of 3 or 4, and then sometimes, there'll be females in the group who are, trafficking these women for, sex work.
Traffickers are criminals of opportunity, right? So they are people who are willing to treat others as things, and that does not discriminate versus on gender, right? So you can have, yes, definitely female traffickers, male traffickers, female and male victims. You can have peer-aged trafficking. Doesn't always have to be someone older who's engaging in the trafficking. You can have multiple layers and large groups, and then you can have very, very tiny single person trafficking even within a domestic relationship.
Like the situation you described earlier with the mother and her daughter. Yeah.
Correct. She took what was available to her and she used it. The only thing you need to succeed in trafficking is a vulnerable population, willing buyers, and inconsistent enforcement.
Yeah. Well, we're up against our break, so we're going to come back from the break and continue our conversation with Kirsten Melton on human trafficking.
The attorneys at BRCK Criminal Defense have helped over 5,000 clients move on with their lives. When an arrest or accusation turns your life upside down, we have the knowledge, experience, and integrity to get your life back on track. Traditional legal ethics, modern legal tactics, the best defense possible to get you through the criminal justice system. Search BRCK Criminal Defense to see our reviews and find out why so many of our clients have trusted us to fight for them. BRCK Criminal Defense, helping our clients move on with their lives.
So we're back. We're talking about human trafficking. With regards to human trafficking, I think primarily when people hear about it, they think about sex trafficking. But you mentioned something about labor exploitation. Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah. So traffickers are excellent at just figuring out what's available to them now. How can I make money now? How can I benefit and profit now? So if you are a company that wants to bring in, let's say, workers from another country, you want to pay them at a below market wage, you want to work them extra hours, then your pitch to them, right, is really going to be, hey, we're going to offer you this wonderful job. You're going to get a green card. You're going to be able to bring your family. We're going to give you X number of hours and X number of payment, and you're going to have housing and all of these things. And that's a very different kind of dynamic than if you're talking about someone who wants to place a 16-year-old girl on an internet sex website for sale to buyers. So labor trafficking exists and can exist in pretty much any industry you can imagine. When I was at the Attorney General's office, I was involved with our civil team that was part of my human trafficking group on a case where it was a woman who was using her bilingual Spanish schools to traffic teachers. To traffic teachers. And people are like, teachers? Teachers are victims of trafficking? Yeah, teachers can be victims of trafficking. I think we have in our mind it's just runaway children, right, for sex. But no, these were women who were educators who were being labor trafficked in very high dollar bilingual pre-K schools. So it helps us to start thinking outside of the cliches, right? And the television pictures that often inform our views of law generally, but certainly of trafficking as well.
Well, and I saw a story, maybe about a year ago where there was this restaurant chain, which I won't name, but they were under investigation and they had been raided because they were allegedly bringing people in to pay them less than minimum wage to work at the restaurant. So, I mean, that's definitely something that exists.
And we talked about the coercion part of it. I'm assuming that's that part of it, and that they come and they bring their families and there's that support that they may not have had. And so is that kind of the part of it that does turn it to that trafficking level?
Well, on the labor trafficking side, if they're coming from somewhere else, oftentimes they're promised that they're going to be able to bring their families, when in reality they're brought here on a temporary visa that can be terminated at any time at the employer's will. And so it's a lot of times false promises in recruiting that are really the fraud piece for international victims of trafficking. The labor trafficking cases that I've worked on here involving domestic victims, I've had personally worked on a case for many years involving the child labor trafficking of kids in a group home for like troubled teens who were then forced into labor. One of the biggest labor trafficking cases that was not prosecuted criminally was Henry's Turkey Service, which were disabled men from the Texas state schools who were worked for decades doing turkey gutting and processing in Atalissa, Iowa. And when you tell that story and you think about the fact that in the heart of our country, right, 30 disabled men from Texas were there, woken up every morning at 3 a.m., dressed out, sent to a turkey processing plant, gutting and eviscerating turkeys, supposed to be being paid $60 a month for that work.
Wow.
We're getting $5 a week to use at the local convenience store on their way back. Fungus growing up their legs when they're found. Several of the men needing to go into nursing homes. People who were struck as they would work, marched with weights over their heads, handcuffed to bunks when they tried to leave, not given health care. This is the lunch meat that is sliced up and that we put on sandwiches and send with our kids to school.
Yeah.
So labor trafficking is one of those things that impacts us at a level of one we put on our table, what we wear, what we purchase, right?
Absolutely.
And it's at a much closer to us level in many ways than the sex trafficking that's occurring if we are not people who are purchasers ourselves.
And I would imagine the labor trafficking cases may be a little difficult in the sense that I would imagine a lot of those relationships start voluntarily. Or with consent.
Oh, sure. Well, you think, right, that you are agreeing to this whole wonderful set of things. It's just like a DV relationship, right? People don't enter into a domestic violence relationship thinking they're going to get beat. They get involved with this person thinking that they're wonderful and amazing and that they're in love and that they're happy and they're going to be happy. And then that person gets a commitment and then that person changes their tactics and wants their needs met above everyone else's. Same thing that's happening in a trafficking relationship. There's the promise of something better. Tiny percentage of victims are truly kidnapped into trafficking. Far, far, far greater percentage are invited in with false promises, with a lure, essentially. And then once the trafficker has that commitment or that control, then those tactics switch to get compliance from you and to keep that compliance as you're moving forward.
Yeah. And that was going to be one of my questions, whether we had any statistics showing like how many of these trafficking victims begin that kind of, I don't want to call it a relationship, but being placed in that situation through kidnapping. Because those are the stories that you always hear.
Well, less than 10%. Yeah, the stories that you hear. Now, I have had a kidnapping case, so it does happen, but it is a very small percentage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's often tied in with the human smuggling, like we talked about, where, that's just not a part of it, right? We have human smuggling and trafficking, which are just kind of two separate things.
People do get smuggled into the United States, and then their smuggler may say, guess what? You owe me a whole new set of money. And if you don't pay that, I'm turning you over to immigration.
Right.
And so if you don't have that money, then yes, you're going to work it off for me.
It's a vulnerability.
Absolutely. It's a vulnerability. Yeah. So it's a way to exploit you and kind of keep you under your thumb.
It's a vulnerability to exploit for that trafficker.
Correct.
Since the time that you've been prosecuting, you had talked about, in the federal system, they passed a law in 2000 and what changes has the state of Texas made to the law in order to address some of these issues?
We've made a lot of changes. So starting in about 2000, Texas created the statewide human trafficking task force, and they began having an omnibus bill each session to work on changes in the law. So in 2011, we shifted to the current statute structure overall. We did not have disabled individuals distinguished out at that time. They were lumped in with non-disabled adults, non-disabled children. But the core structure of the statute was changed in 2011. And we aligned it then with, for instance, all of the parts of the Code of Criminal Procedure that help with child sexual abuse.
Right.
Those things didn't apply to trafficking before. Trafficking became
and which parts are you talking about? Like
so
registration?
The parts that allow for additional evidence to come in, things like 3837, lifetime registration when it comes to adult or child sexual trafficking. Trafficking became a prison-only offense. It had deferred as a possibility for a period of time. Deferred is no longer available.
So that's where you could get probation even if you were convicted.
Correct.
Or you could get probation from a judge on a plea.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So it over time, we've stiffened penalties. We have created more resources for victims, but I will tell you, talk to the victim service providers around this state, we still don't have enough. There are still waiting lists of victims trying to get into programs, trying to access resources. And we still need more breadth and depth in our victim services. So again, that's something that when you think about all of the issues related to cutting grants that have been occurring over the past year in the new Trump administration, a lot of that money goes to serve nonprofits who are serving victims of trafficking. So we certainly have issues there. But Texas has made massive strides in terms of its code and in terms of creating efforts to serve victims. I don't know that we can ever do enough, but we have certainly made a massive effort over the past decade.
I know, some of the penalties have gotten pretty severe.
Oh, they are.
I know, for example, I think continuous trafficking is no parole.
It is a 25 to life, no parole offense for anything involving sex trafficking of a child or a disabled individual. The same thing is true of trafficking itself. So now, as of this last legislative session, trafficking, adults, all categories of trafficking are now first-degree felonies, 5 to 99, prison-only offenses, and no parole for child sex trafficking or the sex trafficking of a disabled individual.
Yeah, so very stiff penalties.
Very stiff
that
penalties.
the state has stepped in with.
Correct.
So you were talking in our last podcast about the organization that you had started to help prosecute some of these cases. When you do that, you're going out to, I guess, rural areas that maybe don't have the resources to...
Yeah, I'm available to any district attorney's office that is looking for someone who has experience trying trafficking cases and wants that experience. Again, lawyers learn through practice. So my view of that is that I can come in, I can help you in whatever stage that you're looking for. So if you want help crafting your indictment, yes, I can help do that. If you want help thinking through your trial strategy, yes, I could come alongside you there. If you want to help trying your case all the way through, can do that too, right? So it's like having kind of your sister court, your big sister who knows how to try these cases, sit with you. Then you've learned it, you've done it, and you move on to start doing those things yourself.
What are some of the complications that maybe a smaller office might have in prosecuting these types of cases in smaller areas?
I think part of it is just, one, it's going to be training your law enforcement to recognize this crime. Many victims of trafficking have criminal histories. Many victims of trafficking have a mistrust of law enforcement and are running from law enforcement. Again, similar to defendants.
Vulnerability.
Correct. Yeah. Many of them struggle with addiction or underlying mental health issues. all of that means, right, that typically they're pushing law enforcement away, not drawing law enforcement in. And so that's one of the big things is oftentimes law enforcement will see victims of trafficking, not recognize them as victims of trafficking and not work up those cases. So in smaller jurisdictions, I've heard many times around the state of Texas, people say, well, we don't have trafficking here.
Right.
And my response is, indeed, you do have trafficking here. And when I train, I have a slide that starts with Corpus Christi, right, which is one of our mid-sized cities, and goes all the way down to a tiny town in Frio County that's got about 200 people. They all have trafficking, right? And how do I know? Because I've tried those cases over the course of time. So 313,000 down to about 287 people. You got trafficking.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
Because trafficking is, do you have a vulnerable population? Do you have someone who's willing to exploit it? And do you have someone who will purchase the goods, service, or person as a result of that? The answer is, yeah, you got that.
Yeah.
You don't need an international port. You don't need NASCAR being held in your city. You don't need the Super Bowl. All you need are those three pieces.
And I guess if you're sitting around waiting for somebody to say, help, I'm being trafficked, a lot of times that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. So you've got to be looking for it. You've got to be able to identify it. Then you've got to know how to work with those victims to try to have them partner with you, right, in the development of that case and the development of that evidence. And then your prosecutors need to be working with your investigators from the beginning so that when you hit brick wall after brick wall, which you will, you can pivot and find a way to look for information somewhere else. And you'll find it, most of the time. There's other sources. And then it's a matter of taking what pieces you have and putting together a successful prosecution. So part of that is teaching prosecutors and teaching investigators to look for everyone involved in the trafficking scheme. Everyone, not just a single person. Like I had a case out of San Marcos that had two separate recruiters, that had the actual main trafficker, that had a woman who was involved in the sexual assault of the underage victim as well. And then there was a buyer. Ultimately, we wrapped up all of those people and a driver. For the trafficker. Ultimately, we wrapped up all of those people in the course of the investigation. So then when our victim became uncooperative and was not going to work with us, we were able to work with defense counsel, bring in defendants, flip people, be able to tell the victim's story by the people who were there and participating in the conduct, and ultimately send our trafficker to prison while still having accountability for all of these other people who were willing to work with us in the process.
Yeah. So if there's a prosecutor out there who's watching our podcast and says, hey, I may have an issue in my county, I might need some help, how would they get in touch with you?
They can call me. They can email me. So you can reach me through kirsta.melton@justicestartsnow.org. You can go to my website at justicestartsnow.org. And I'm happy to take calls and emails. I do, from law enforcement, from prosecutors, and from victim service providers all over the state.
And if there are people out there listening who worry that, maybe they saw something, maybe they're aware of something, what should they be doing?
Sure. So if it is an emergency, you want to call 911 and you want to tell them that you think this is trafficking. And if you're wrong, then what should happen is a trafficking detective should go out there and they should be able to assess the situation. And maybe there's a different type of crime that's occurring, or maybe it is trafficking. So tell them what you think. 2, if it's not an emergency, but you want to report it, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-3737-888. And that will take a report. They will also connect, for instance, if a victim calls that number, they can be connected to resources in their area. But that should also send information down to local law enforcement so that there can be an actual investigation. But here's what I would tell you. Don't wait. If you see something, right, try to get actionable information. What kind of car? How many people? What do they look like? Don't wait on that information, call it in so that that victim isn't gone, right? And so that that victim actually is able to get the help that they need in that moment at that time. It is calls like that that literally have saved the lives of victims, that have removed them from exploitation that otherwise they would have remained in for significant periods of time. The public is critical on this. It's important for you to kind of know enough about trafficking to distinguish that. And again, if you'll go to justicestartsnow.org on the resource page, there are lists of red flags for sex trafficking, for labor trafficking, for illicit massage. All of those are there, and they are a free resource available to the public.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. Time goes by fast. I think we went a little bit over, but this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you for being on, Ms. Melton.
My pleasure.
This is Jacob Lindberg and Steve Barrera for So You Got Arrested.
Thanks for listening to So You Got Arrested. If you found this podcast helpful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more legal insights and real talk from the front lines of the Texas justice system, follow us and subscribe. And remember, BRCK Criminal Defense has your back. For more information, visit us at brckdefense.com.